Hello, Garland Nixon here. It's Wednesday morning, and we are hanging out with Joti Brar, and we've got some very interesting things to talk about. As always, let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Joti Brar, and as always, we've got interesting things to talk about. Frightening, horrifying, but revolutionary. So I think that's good. Oh, whoa! Hold on a second. I got to get Rockfin going. All right, I think we're rolling. All right, Joti, something that's interesting I find, and I'll throw this at you. So I'm looking at various economic models going on here throughout Europe, Germany, and France. The UK, I'm not going to say the UK is at the bottom, but they're so close to the bottom. If they hit the bottom, they wouldn't make a sound. Okay. And I was listening to someone the other day talking about, and they were talking to a bunch of MPs or something in the UK, and they were like, things are terrible, things are horrible. What are we going to do? And the MPs were like talking about Ukraine. Yes, well, what about Ukraine? Like, there is no concern amongst the ruling elite. I imagine there is for the plight of the masses, shockingly, but their only concern is we must continue the war in Ukraine. I suspect there is a connection. Joti Brar.
Thanks, Garland. There is 100% a connection between the desperation to keep the Ukraine war going to the conclusion that the imperialists still hope they can get to, which is the fall of Russia, the breakup, the looting of Russia. That's the goal of the war in Ukraine, right? It's not the liberation of the Ukrainian people who were deliberated in 1991, further deliberated in 2004, and completely couped in 2014, right? The liberation of the Ukrainian people is not on the agenda of any of the Western powers. What they want is to use Ukraine to bring down Russia. They want to break Russia into pieces. They want to loot its resources. They want to control its political system so they can control its wealth, its markets, its people. That's their aim. And they need it desperately because, as you said, the economic situation, the crisis, the global crisis of capitalism is getting worse day by day. And the more that they fail in their endeavors to bring back demand to their economy through the wars, the more they're seen to be failing on their war fronts, the more desperate their situation gets. Because we talked, I think last time we were talking, we talked about Trump talking up the markets, right? The market confidence is going in sector after sector. You know, there was a big load of hype, wasn't there, into the whole AI sector. And there's a kind of sense that, if we can turn this basically chat GPT type model of, they're calling it intelligence, but it's, it's a big data model. It does some things well, it's kind of cool, but there's a massive hype around it. And the massive hype is because if they can monopolize this technology and then make people believe that you need it for everything, maybe that's a way out of the crisis. Maybe that's a way to garner huge, to basically extract rent from the whole world, because they've got the technology, they've monopolized it, and now everybody has to buy it off us because without it, you're going to go bust, and you're no longer viable. Everybody must have, and must pay the top dollar subscription rate because we own it. And there was this sense when Trump came in, they were talking this up massively. And then that was holed, wasn't it, below the waterline by the DeepSeek developments. Of this type of thing is going on all the time in the economy. All around the world, people are looking at the fact that they get a much better deal if they go to business with China than they get if they go into business with the West, whether it's the EU, Britain, US, or some combination of the above with Western finance capital. So there are, and this is all exacerbating the fact that at the root of this all, there's a massive overproduction crisis. We've talked about it lots of times. I won't go into the details of what that means again. Please do refer back to earlier videos or to Karl Marx if you want to understand more about that concept. But the whole thing is, you know, this is a crisis the capitalists can't solve. They can't bring back demand into the market because they've impoverished the people who need to buy the things around the world, globally. It's a global marketplace, and the masses of the people of the world are too poor to buy the products that their own work has produced, right? That's a problem of capitalist production. That's a problem that the capitalists can't escape. And because their system is now global, their crisis is global. Now, we saw that Lenin identified this during the First World War, but this is what we're looking at now. That capitalism has become monopoly capitalism, and it's become a global system. This is what imperialism in the modern era means. It's not like the Roman Empire. It doesn't just mean expansion and domination of a bit of the globe. It's a global system of capitalism at its monopoly stage. And because the market is global, the crisis is global. And so no individual capitalist or capitalist country can solve the crisis in their own market in an isolated way, right? Britain can't have a strategy for solving the crisis because the crisis is global, right? If like British capital has been having these crises since 1820. That's how long capitalism has been finding that, its home market is glutted. The people at home are too poor to buy the goods we've made them produce. The only thing we can do is expand abroad, make our markets bigger around the world. That was the basis on which Britain became the workshop of the world in the 19th century. But that's not what Britain is anymore. Britain now is a completely parasitic excrescence on the body of the world, simply using the British ruling class, using its huge wealth to extract rent from the planet. And that's what it needs to keep doing in order to survive as a class, in order for the system to keep going. The capitalist imperialist system to keep going requires this to carry on. And so the war against Russia and the war against China, the war against Iran, the war against the DPRK, these are all aimed at re-establishing the dominance of Western finance capital and kick-starting the economy, bringing back demand. So first of all, you get demand from making war, huge need for armaments production, and that enriches a section of the ruling class. Then you get demand by reconstruction after you've made a load of damage, right? That's a big Kickstarter. If you look back to the last time Britain and most of the West had a real economic boom time, a real boom, it was after World War II. Why? Because there was so much reconstruction to be done. There had been so much destruction. So this is the destruction wasn't just of wealth and facilities and infrastructure and productive capacity. It was also destruction of things that had already been produced and of people. And this is all the blood price that capitalism demands in order to keep going for another few decades. And that's what we're looking at right now, Garland. We're looking at capitalism trying to pay the necessary blood price in order to re-stabilize on a very shaky basis itself for another decade or two. If we don't resist it, if we don't stop it from re-stabilizing itself, that is what it will do. But the blood price, as we can see, is enormous and totally catastrophic for the life of, huge section of the population of the planet. And, the genocide in Palestine is just a taster. It's just a taster. The destruction of the male population of Ukraine is just a taster of what's in store if we don't stop this in its tracks, right? So, but yes, this economic decline it's all a symptom of the overproduction crisis and the desperation of our rulers to reverse their economic problems by means of looting parts of the world. That is very real. It's very serious. Nothing can stop that bar a complete change of the system. You can't vote in a government in the West that can reverse that, because it's a systemic problem, and the ruling class that manages the system under which we live, the capitalist system, the imperialist system in the Western countries, that ruling class is not dislodged when you change the government. They are still in power. They still hold the reins of power. They're still the bosses of the journalists. They're still the bosses of the executives of the corporations. They're still the bosses of the government and the parliamentarians. They are the bosses of the civil servants, right? Unless you dislodge them and take apart their whole machinery for keeping control of the country, there is no way to reverse this war drive and this economic nosedive.
You know, one of the things that I find interesting, and there's a different dynamic than, say, pre-World War I or II, and that is the growth of the anti-imperialist front, shall we say, the power of China and Russia. This time around, China and Russia are far more powerful in a number of ways and far more united because they have delivered for the masses. That's the reason. It's not because they've done it. They delivered for the masses, and the imperialists are living it. You know, in Europe, they're in this world like, we have to take Russia. We have to, and everyone who's looking at them saying, they're far more powerful than you. Economically, you're broke and they're growing. Militarily, you got nothing. They're stronger. And I have to add this. I got to get your comment on this. The legacy of the Soviet Union. Something interesting happened. There was a meeting in Alaska, and Sergei Lavrov showed up, and he had a CCCP shirt on, not USSR. It was written in Russian, so clearly it was speaking. I interviewed someone from Russia recently who grew up in the Soviet Union and is very proud of it, and he was basically saying there was a lot of smiles. There were a lot of people, you know, there. It was clearly a message to the people, but he proudly displayed. And here's what's interesting, very interesting. When asked about that, apparently President Putin laughed and said, maybe he's an imperialist. They're using the word imperialism now. They're reaching back to the legacy of the Soviet Union. They're kind of, you know, throwing this joke around, but it seems to me that it's aimed back, and it's aimed to the anti-imperialist front, and it's aimed to Africa and South America and the people that have suffered. At any rate, your thoughts. To me, symbolism is very, very powerful. When I saw that, I thought, I gotta ask Joti what she thinks. I knew you were smiling.
It was the ultimate troll, wasn't it? It was of course, people like me, and I think I am like a lot of people in the former Soviet territories in the reaction that I had, which was, that's brilliant. That made me smile. Because it will have totally got up the noses of the imperialist hosts. It's a real kind of, it's a little, small little two fingers, isn't it? That we're not your puppets anymore. And we're not looking for your like total acceptance the way we used to. You know, it used to be that they did a lot of, and probably they still refer to America as our partners. I don't know. I haven't noticed that recently, actually, but it used to drive me slightly crazy. But they do all of this kind of genuflecting before the idea of our partners, our American partners, our European partners, and all this stuff. But they wanted more than anything, didn't they? The new Russian bourgeois, even once they'd become a national bourgeoisie headed up by the Putin government, they really wanted to be accepted as equals by the West. And they thought there was a way to make that happen. And they thought, if we play by our rules, if we dress your way, if we follow diplomatic protocols, if we, you know, keep to our side of every bargain, if, you know, follow the rules-based international order, and we'll all be friends together. And then over time, they came to the correct conclusion that the imperialists are agreement incapable. You can't trust them. There's only one language they understand. It's the language of force. And they're not interested in being partners. They want us to be their colony. And once they realize that, and they're like, well, we're not going to be your colony, actually, then this was really the moment at which I think the SMO was launched in Ukraine. This moment of realization that they're not going to stop. They're not going to take polite warnings. They're not listening to our words. They don't believe we mean them, because they're so used to saying things that mean nothing to them, right? They'll contradict themselves every 2 seconds, the Western leaders, won't they? And they will tear up every agreement they ever sign. They don't take our words seriously either. They just see it as a, just something to say. They're not listening.
Empire of Lies, the Empire of Lies speech.
Empire
you
of
remember
Lies.
that? Recall that? Everyone should read the Empire of Lies speech by Vladimir Putin.
That's right. So the Russians don't say things. And there you see how the Russian political landscape, even the parts of it that are totally anti-communist, owe their way of thinking in a large part to their Soviet history. There's not very many of them that really reach back to the Tsarist empire period and, really continue those traditions. There's some people who sort of try, but in reality, a lot of the way they think about the world and about politics is very much based on the kind of Soviet model of thinking, which is, do as you would be done by, and be honest in your international dealings, and, assume the best and be the best. What we have seen since the launch of the SMO is that a real recognition by Russia that, as we said, the imperialists are agreement incapable, and that the only way you're going to stop them is to force them to stop. And that's what the special military operation in Ukraine has been all about, slowly but steadily undermining the ability of the imperialists of NATO to use Ukraine as a battering ram to bring down Russia. That's what they've been doing, and they've been doing it successfully. And it's had a huge backfiring effect, hasn't it? Now, what's interesting to me is Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov, wearing that CCP, i.e. USSR shirt, wasn't just a little kind of two fingers up at his hosts. It was, as you say, a signal to people at home. And it's a reminder, and it's another way in which the whole war against Russia has massively backfired on the West, because having failed to topple Russia quickly, which was definitely plan A, right? I don't agree with the analysis that says, oh, they never thought they could bring Russia down. They did think they could bring Russia down. They absolutely did. They absolutely did. Plan A was massive overwhelm, just like they did recently with Iran. They thought they'd laid enough internal bonfires that they could ignite them all at once, do a massive PR job externally, create a military crisis, and in the combination of a political crisis, a social crisis, economic crisis, and a military crisis, the regime would fall, right? That was their aim. That was their plan A. It didn't work. So then they've gone to plan B, which is lean back into can we wear Russia down? Can we just keep the war going for long enough that a social crisis and an economic crisis will develop anyway, even though plan A didn't work out? They're very much leaning into that now. It's absolutely, as lots of people have pointed out, been war gamed many years in advance, how to overextend Russia, how to bring about a social collapse. But the thing is, all of these plans and games are out there in the public domain. It's perfectly clear to Russia, I'm sure, at this point, what their aim is. The Russians are not stupid, and they have seen that in order to win the war in Ukraine, which is what they have to do, they have to win. They have to create conditions on the ground that make it impossible for the West to keep trying to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. In order to do that, they have to mobilize their population. And in order to bring the population along with them, they have to lean into their Soviet legacy and heritage, the planning of the economy of important sectors. It's not a whole planned economy, sadly, but important sectors, including energy and military production are in the hands of the state now, and run very much on the Soviet model, which is you have capacity for surges when you need them. You have spare capacity, which capitalist economics says is inefficient. You're keeping empty space that you don't need. Why would you do that? That's not efficient. But if you're planning for contingencies, it makes total sense. That's how the socialist system works. That's how Soviet factories were set up. And those Soviet factories are what capitalist Russia has inherited. It hasn't inherited a capitalist model and way of thinking and way of constructing things. It is operating its capitalism on a totally new and strange basis, which is on the basis of a former socialist economy. That's not your classic capitalist setup, right? It's a kind of a weird hybrid. That's not to say the people running it wish they were running the Soviet Union. They don't. But there is a lot of the population, of course, wish it was the Soviet Union again. And it was during Soviet times that the people could be mobilized. They felt pride in their country. Their needs were being taken care of, right? They had homes and jobs and a sense of pride and a sense of a positive future, but also other aspects of, so in order to survive and withstand the economic onslaughts of the West, the Russians had to lean into the Soviet legacy of planning. In other sectors too, they had to revive their agricultural sector, which they had let go to pieces after 1991. And in the Yeltsin era, they made massive steps backwards in all spheres of agriculture. Well, they've had to regain those positions because, as we know, a country that can't feed itself is totally open to blackmail by the imperialist powers. It can be starved. It can be throttled, right? It can be blackmailed all the time. It can be sabotaged. So the Russians understood that. They have a history from the Soviet period. The Soviet Union, the socialist Soviet Union, abolished famine across the entire territory of what had once been the Russian Empire, where famines had been a common occurrence, right, for the poor peasantry. They were abolished by socialism, just like famine was abolished by socialist China. The last famine took place in the early socialist times, and it's always held up like that was a crime of socialism, but of course it wasn't. It was the last famine. Famines had been normal. The last one happened in the Soviet period, but then they were abolished. It was the last time it could happen. So the Russia has this Soviet history of having been completely self-sufficient in all spheres of agriculture, and they've headed back in that direction in order to feed their people and stop the West being able to blackmail them with food supplies and choking off food supplies. And of course, that is certainly a quick way to create regime change conditions, isn't it? If you're starving a population, you only have to ask the Venezuelans about that and how hard it is to keep your country going when they are being starved into submission. Ask the Yemenis how hard it is to keep an anti-imperialist revolution going when your people are being starved into submission by the imperialists. So it's a number one rule. If you really want sovereignty, is you must be growing your own food. And because of their Soviet legacy, the Russian government was able to take steps back in that direction. And they started doing that in 2014, which was when the sanctions war started to ratchet up against Russia because Ukraine lost Crimea. And the imperialists were absolutely livid about it because for them, Crimea was the prize of Ukraine. And they couldn't believe that it slipped through their fingers just when they thought they'd got it. So they, that was the moment at which they really got the knives out for Russia in a big, big way. But yeah, they kind of put Russia on notice that economic warfare is going to keep ratcheting up against you. And the Russians were sensible enough to start taking countermeasures. And so we saw, again, another way that the Ukraine war backfired was that when the West in 2022 used the propaganda of saying, oh my God, Russia invaded Ukraine, when of course Russia was pushed into a position where it had no choice but to go and to the aid of the people in the Donbass, no choice left, right? And again, you can look further into the details of that. I won't outline all of the reasons why now, but Russia was pushed into that It spent a decade trying not to do that. And then finally it was like, we're going to have to do it. Okay, so it was pushed into that. And then the West launched this propaganda blitzkrieg that really overwhelmed the masses in most of the world, actually. Even in a lot of neutral states, people were initially kind of shocked because it seemed as if it all came out of the blue, and it was presented by Western media like Vladimir Putin woke up one day and was a maniac and just decided that he was going to take Ukraine, and isn't that awful? And so we had all of this very emotive propaganda, and on the back of that propaganda drive, the West unleashed, EU and USA unleashed this huge sanctions program. And the idea was to collapse the Russian economy. They had told themselves that the Russian economy could be collapsed. And they had ignored all the ways in which Russia was firming its economy up. They had ignored all the real strengths of the Russian economy, which they don't respect whatsoever, because to them, the only power is finance, capital power, not the power to really produce things, but the power to pay people all over the world to do your bidding. They didn't appreciate the strength of Russia's economy, its ability to survive that sanctions blitzkrieg. And because of that, the whole thing backfired on them, and their sanctions, the price for the sanctions has been paid in their own economies. But it brings us back to something important, what you were saying at the beginning about the nosedive in the economies, because what we're also seeing during this crisis is what we see in every capitalist crisis, which is a further consolidation and concentration of wealth. So what you're seeing is huge sections of the Western economies are going to the wall. Small businesses, medium businesses, even quite big businesses are in massive trouble, but there are a few companies and hedge funds at the very top which are buying everything up. They're in a position, it's like a fire sale, you know, when lots of companies are going to the wall, you can get them at rock bottom prices. You can buy them up, you can take them apart, you can asset strip them. You know, we saw the similar process happen during COVID, didn't we? A whole load of businesses went to the wall and they were let go to the wall, but certain sectors were cleaning up. Big tech was one of them, right? Retail, even big retail chains going bust, but Amazon, you know, exploding in importance globally. So this is a common feature. Every time there's a crisis in the capitalist economy, many smaller companies will go bust. And at this point in the development of capitalism, what counts as small might be really big. But some companies at the top will become even bigger and more consolidated. And this is a constant process, which is why we now today see that these huge hedge funds that are literally buying the planet, Garland. Everything you see, the hedge funds are buying it up. You know, now we find out that they own the planes in the RAF, for example, and I'll find out that they are buying up what's supposed to be social housing in the new build housing estate down the road from me, and everything. You know, they're buying up what are supposedly independent healthcare providers that get contracts from the NHS, but behind them stands a hedge fund. You know, and even the hugest companies like Amazon, you know, like JP Morgan. You look at who are their biggest shareholders. And it's all hedge funds, right? So they literally own the planet at this point. Well, whatever is within reach of them. Of course, they don't own the DPRK. They don't own all of Russia, which is driving them crazy. They don't own all of China, which is driving them crazy. You know, so there are parts of the world they can't profit off the back of. But everything they can get hold of, they are doing. And so we see, you know, that is a process that always goes on when there is economic crisis within capitalism. It accelerates the process of concentration of wealth. But that in itself accelerates the crisis, because the whole crisis has come about, remember, because the masses are too poor to buy anything. Well, the more you concentrate wealth in the hands of a tiny number of people, the more that you are accelerating that very problem that's created the crisis, right? So this is the Gordian knot that the capitalist economics brings you into that can't be untangled. It can only be cut. And the cutting force is the revolutionary masses who say, up with this, we will not put, right? We have had enough of all of this. The only way out of this is something completely new. Of course, that takes a lot of organization, doesn't it? But in the meantime, the way the ruling class is trying to keep us pacified or distracted or diverted or misdirected, while they try to somehow bring back profitability to their system, which basically means, as we said, pushing us into World War III and destroying a whole load of productive forces and bringing down independent countries and looting them and enslaving their people, all of that to try to bring back stability. While they're doing that, and while at the same time, the cost of living is going crazy, the economies are in massive crisis, everything about life is getting worse, even for workers in the richest countries in the world, much worse by the day. What they are doing for us is distracting us with anti-immigrant pogroms. You are having it in the States. And interestingly, I saw a video. I have no idea if this is true or not. These days, it's hard to tell now when a video is served up to you on YouTube. Is it real or is someone faking it? But it was interesting because it purported to be someone in an airport in a kind of what would normally be a busy tourist center somewhere in the USA. I think it was in the southern states. And she basically showed the airport and the plane. And it was a plane from Britain to the USA empty. And she said, the tourists aren't coming. And the tourists are, so that USA has a massive tourist industry, right? And it's suffering. Why? Because all of these anti-immigrant pogroms are sweeping up all kinds of unintended victims that is scaring people around the world. Like, oh my God, I can't even go on holiday there. I could end up, in a detention center being, tortured and locked up and, sent into the equivalent of some, Florida Guantanamo. And maybe that's not the best way to end your holiday, right? So that's happening in the USA. In Britain, we have a rerun, basically, of what we had last year, which is deliberately stirred up anti-immigrant riots. And interestingly, the particular group that's at the forefront of them, I mean, all of the leaders of these groups, they're all state assets of various types. We have someone who calls himself Tommy Robinson, but his real name is, I forget his first name, but it's Yaxley Lennon is his surname, right? And he basically works for MI5. But they trot him out every now and again. He's the head of something called English Defence League, EDL, which is a kind of rabidly fascistic anti-immigrant, very, just super racist, openly racist group, right? But there's a whole bunch of them with different gradations of their racism and of their anti-immigrant rhetoric. And this time, the leading force in a bunch of these, there was a kind of coordinated set of demonstrations around the country, led by a party that really had kind of gone out of the public eye after Brexit, called UKIP. Now, the irony about UKIP is it stands for UK Independence Party. But recently, after their former leader was Nigel Farage, who now heads up, he set up the Brexit Party, and then it's turned into Reform. And now he's being billed as possibly Britain's next prime minister, right? And in line with the possibility that he might become Britain's prime minister, he's changing all of the policies he had that might have been offensive to the ruling class. Like, for example, 10 years ago, he was against the Ukraine war. Right? Not anymore. So, and even he was marketing himself as Mr. Anti-Woke, right? And apparently now his party's done some kind of a bit of a U-turn on the transgender question. So yeah, that's a bit random, right? But you see how, if he's being possibly groomed to be a prime minister, then he has to know how to, put the message the right way. So we see how the machine works. But he was always a city banker, right? I mean, he was never a man of the people. It's like Donald Trump being a man of the people. It's laughable. But nevertheless, he's been presented as that. The narrative has been, look at him with his flat hat and his pipe, is one of us, and he doesn't like the immigrants either. He's really just like you, isn't he? So, but Reform have not been the party stirring up the pogroms, and nor have EDL this time. This time it's been UKIP. And the interesting thing about UKIP, since they lost Nigel Farage, is that their current leadership is basically under the control of, now I forget the name of the outfit. Sorry, it's gone out of my head, but they've become a spin-off of an American outfit. So although they're, it's another anti-immigrant thing, but the funny thing is they're called UK Independence Party, but they've now become basically the UK arm of an American organization. So that's their idea of UK independence. But well, obviously the dog whistle in the name is independence. It used to be independence from the EU. Now it's independence from all these awful immigrants, right? And they've been having demonstrations where they walk around with banners saying mass deportations now. And they get a massive police escort to do it. And the police escort is usually twice as big as the demonstration, right? And then what you have is a counter demonstration, which is twice as big again. But what's interesting to me about this situation, and what's really noticeable, is on both sides, the people are being led by state agents, right? So you have the demonstration, UKIP, EDL, Reform, the whole anti-immigrant mob is led by state agents. It's totally against the interests of the working class. It's there to divert your anger and point it back at other workers instead of allowing you to vent it against the system that is making your life so hellish, right? So that's one side. Then who have you got on the other side? A bunch of people whose primary foot soldier organizers are Trotskyites, state assets, whose job is to confuse people about what race, where racism really comes from. Racism is a problem of bad people, bad parties, bad policies. What racism is never connected with is the system of imperialism, which of course you can't get rid of racism without getting rid of imperialism. But instead these, again, well-meaning people, and this is what drives me crazy, Garland, is on both sides, you've got people with justified anger, justified resentment against the system, who really want to make life better for ordinary people, being told to blame one another for the problem. So on one side, you've got a bunch of workers being told to blame the immigrants, and usually the poorest and most vulnerable immigrants, for their problems. On the other side, you have workers who genuinely, hate to see racism and division in society, being taught that the way to oppose that is to fight the fash, as they're told, and that means go and try and have a punch up with what you're told is the fascists and the enemy, which is a bunch of workers over there who are being misdirected themselves, right? So there's no attempt to help those workers see how they're being misled. Neither is there any attempt from the leaders of the so-called anti-racists or anti-fascists to help those people who want to stop racism understand where racism really comes from. The message is always it's bad people. Their biggest enemy is Donald Trump, right? Oh, because but what's the message when the biggest enemy is Donald Trump? It's like bring back Joe Biden. It's that level of analysis. It doesn't.
Kamala Harris, she's a diverse woman. We got it made. If she comes in, the bombs that she dropped on Gaza will come down and hug the people. It won't tear them to shreds like the other ones.
Exactly so. So you have this complete misdirection of the justified anger of two sets of workers being put against one another in a culture wars paradigm. And all of it serves ruling class interests, which is to distract us and divide us, misdirect us, stop us coming together to fight against the system, Garland. And that is what they're working very, very hard at everywhere across the West at the moment.
Well, let me add this. In America, okay, when people talk about slavery, right, I always say this. They didn't go get those people because they were black. They wanted free labor. That's what it was. It was free. They were going out of the world. I'm going to take your gold. I'm going to take your silver. I'm going to take your, I need to take labor. They stole labor in the business sense. That's what it was about. So when someone goes and says, there's a picture of Joe Blow, he was a slave owner, let's deface the picture and the bust of him, and over here they've got a statue of him, we'll burn him, knock him down, and all of that, as though Joe Blow, the guy who owned slaves or whatever, he was the guy. Now, I understand the importance of symbolism. I'm just saying, you're still seeing slavery through the lens of race. You're not seeing slavery through the lens of free labor. And when you see it through the lens of free labor, you understand. One of the things I bring up, this is important, give me about a minute. There was a book by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. After it was written, the slave owners got mad and they launched really what would be the first real honest attack on capitalism. They then started authorizing and paying for books to be written to oppose Uncle Tom's Cabin. It made slavery look bad. It made the Southern planter class look bad. It was called The Northern Planter's Bride. This book said, well, yeah, well, these are slaves, fair enough, blah, blah, blah. But look what you guys are doing. You got the company towns, and these are white people, and you're bringing them in, and you're working them to death, and they're being torn apart and messed up. They've got unsafe. So they launched a legitimate attack on capitalism. And it was like, okay, let's not just kind of ignore what we're doing. It's good because these are childlike slaves. We got to look out for them anyway. A little bit of rape and stuff every now and then. That's not important. What we're really talking, and so basically, but if you really look at it from an aerial view, it's like, yeah, you're right. Slavery is wrong, but it's not just wrong for moral reasons. Excuse me, it is wrong for moral reasons, but it wasn't done for moral or immoral reasons. It was done for economic reasons. And you're right. There's varying degrees. You've got the lowest degree, which is free labor. But then the rich Northerners, they're like, well, these are white people. We can't exactly enslave them per se, but we'll find a way to enslave them. So what you see is varying degrees of the ruling elite saying, how can we abuse the masses? How much can we get away with? If these people, we can get away with abusing them more, we can't quite get away with as much. So we'll treat them as badly as we can kind of get away with. And then arguing it out, pointing fingers at each other. And my point was, well, they were both right.
They were both right. You know, Karl Marx characterized the system of capitalism as a system of wage slavery. And it was very important for workers to understand that we are still enslaved under capitalism. There's no such thing as freedom in an abstract sense. It doesn't make any sense. Freedom from what? We are free from the shackles of serfdom. We are free from the physical chains of slavery. But as a class, the proletariat, the working class under capitalism, is still enslaved collectively to the capitalists. Now, in many ways, this type of enslavement is more convenient for the capitalists. They can still work us to death, and they do, right? But they don't have to pay us when they're not using our labor. Brilliant. They don't have to house us. They don't have to make sure we get medical care. There's a whole load of things they don't have to do. They don't have to pay for our clothes. They can say, oh, well, if you can't afford clothes, you're not managing your wages properly, are you? Capitalism for the worker is freedom to be exploited by capital or to die in a ditch. That's your freedom, right? It's not real freedom. You know, there's a beautiful quote by Stalin in an interview he gave to an American journalist. I'm going to mangle it because I don't have it in front of me to read and I don't have it properly memorized. But he basically said, I can't imagine any real freedom for a person who doesn't have guaranteed place to live, doesn't have guaranteed work, doesn't have a guarantee of food on the table. What kind of freedom is that? What kind of liberty does somebody really have if their options in life are so narrow? And they have no access to, you know, the means to change that. The truth is that for as long as we have a division of society into a minority exploiting class, that's a minority that lives from the wealth produced by the exploited minority. And we've had three main eras of that, Garland, in human history. So early days, which is actually most of human history, but in the early days of human history, we were tribal animals. We were basically egalitarian groups. It's classified by Marxists, that whole era, as primitive communism. Then we had the split, the development of productive forces, the ability to produce more than one person can eat. So to then develop a surplus product. This development in productive techniques, the development of agriculture, the development of animal husbandry brought about a split in society into owners, appropriators, and exploited. Exploiters and exploited. And the first version of that was slave owners and slaves. That's the ancient slave societies. then more developments of production meant that the slavery model didn't really work with the new means of production. You needed the slave to work a bit harder than they work under slavery, which is just reluctantly and under the crack of the whip. He needed to be a bit invested in production in order to use the new tools in a better way. And therefore, serfdom came about, whereby the serf works some of his time for free, he gives to the lord of the manor, and some of the time he works on his own strips to feed himself and his family. He's tied to the land. He's basically a slave, but he has a level of freedom that makes him work a bit harder and is more suited to new means of production. But it's not that different from slavery, really, is it? There's a lot of rights he doesn't have. He's tied to the land. He's tied to his lord. He's, he can't just go off and make himself a new life somewhere random. Then you have the development of new type of productive forces, capitalist productive forces, which require people to be disconnected from the land. When you have manufacturing being set up, you are collecting large numbers of workers in one place to make things in common because it's more efficient and you make more money that way. So you move from the medieval guild type of small workshop production where you have, a master and a journeyman and a couple of apprentices like that, into a bigger manufacturing setup where you do lots of processes in the same place. So you have a lot of people working in common, and that turns out to be more efficient, and there's more money to be made by the master of that concern. But to do that type of production, you need to free the people from the land. So the famous freedom we have under capitalism is freedom from the land. That was the big movements across Europe. The capitalist revolutions were quickly followed by enclosures, right, where capitalist farmers who used to be feudal lords became capitalist landowners and farmers, and they started enclosing large areas of land that used to be common land, used to be farmed by ordinary serfs to live off, and said, no, this is mine now, bugger off to the towns, you're needed in the manufactories, and I'm using this for my private purposes, for my sheep, for my deer, for whatever. And the people were freed to go and be fodder for the manufacturers, right? So this was the development of capitalism, and it remains true that as a class, the working class is collectively enslaved to the capitalist class. If they don't employ us, we starve. On the flip side, we must never forget, because we're always taught that means that they're the wealth creators. But the truth is we create the wealth, but we don't have the means to create wealth in our hands, because now the means to create wealth are enormous factories. They're enormous farms. They're trawlers, which are as big as a city at sea, right? So you have to be a billionaire owner of capital in order to produce things in the modern world. And therefore, an ordinary person can only be productive if he's employed by an owner of capital who owns a factory or owns a means of production of some kind and will employ you and make money out of you. So we are collectively enslaved, and that's why Marx correctly called capitalism wage slavery. And the only way to become liberated is to take the next step forward, which is where the working class becomes the ruling class, takes hold of these incredibly productive means of production that we now have, these huge factories, all of this amazing technology and ability to produce in abundance, and uses them to make a plan for production. So we're no longer producing to make a profit that a few people then appropriate and become vastly wealthy. We're working for ourselves. We're working for society. We're working to produce what we've worked out we need. And on that basis, we can provide for ourselves a rising standard of living for everybody, nobody left behind, right? The capability is there. It's been produced under conditions of capitalism, but capitalism can't use those, because under capitalism, the only function, the only purpose for the means of production is to produce profit that then is appropriated by a dwindling handful of people. And the masses who are producing all that wealth get poorer in that process. So capitalism brings itself to a full stop. The difficulty is, because these interests are so entrenched, they can't be dislodged without a fight. the system has been ripe for revolution for more than 100 years, but revolutionary crises, come up at certain junctures, and then the masses have to be organized to use that crisis to push through into the next stage of development of society. But when you have that historical overview, it's very helpful in busting the myth that capitalism is either a reflection of human nature or the end of history or an inevitable way that things are, right? Capitalism is one step on the development of mankind from primitive communism to advanced communism. It's just one step on the way, and it's outlived everything useful it had to offer society. It finished delivering up, 150 years ago. At this point, it's only holding us back. As soon as we recognize that, as soon as we realize it not only can be got rid of, but it must be got rid of so that we can move history forwards, then things start to be a lot simpler, and you start to see through a lot of the narratives that we're given a lot more easily.
I did want to ask before we go, we've got about 10 minutes, your thoughts on they've been trying to hide the nature of Zionism, as much as they could. You could, if you really paid attention, you're like, holy moly, this is just absolutely, knuckle dragging brutality we're looking at here, right? And now that's just, they're just like, okay, yeah, it is what it is, but we're going to do it anyway. And you're seeing, the true nature of imperialism. To me, that is the leading edge. If you want to understand imperialism, if you want to understand this creature we're looking at, Gaza, it's brutal, it's violent, it's demonic. And I'm not a religious guy, but that's the only word that I can think of that applies.
100%, Garland. And what's frustrating for people like me is, having known this a long time, we've been shouting and screaming about it for so long, and that this is not exactly the first time. This is one in a long string that goes back 400 years. As Karl Marx said, capital came into the world dripping from blood from head to foot, dripping in blood from head to foot. That's what he says in Capital when he talks about the genesis of capital, how originally was enough capital amassed to fuel the creation of these large productive forces. It was through the looting, pillaging, and genociding of peoples all over the world. And this is the way that the ruling class sees the rest of the world, including their own people, is as non-humans, subhumans, Untermenschen, disposable cannon fodder. They don't consider us to be real, intelligent human beings. They don't consider us to have agency. They consider us to be only, what did they used to say about the slaves? Only 3/5 of human being. But that's their attitude actually to their own working class. They will try to create supremacist ideologies for any section of the planet to keep people divided and fighting each other. But above it all, they're laughing because they think all of us are, basically inhuman or subhuman or underlings of some kind, totally disposable and manipulable. That's the whole way of thinking of the elite ruling classes. Zionism is a tool of imperialism. I had a little back and forth with someone. I try not to get involved in back and forths on Twitter, but I got sucked in because I was making a comment about anti-Zionism. And the guy said to me, because it's become a fashion now. Everybody's claiming themselves to be anti-Zionist because they realize that anti-Zionism is a sentiment that's gripping the population. But rather than explain to people that to be anti-Zionist, you have to be anti-imperialist, they just jump around going, I'm an anti-Zionist too. And they hope that they're going to jump the bandwagon and get some votes out of it or get some following out of it. And I pointed out that, for example, nobody who cheered the fall of Syria a year and a half ago is an anti-Zionist. Are they? Nobody. Or was that half a year ago? God, I'm losing my mind. Anyway, nobody who cheered the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government can say they're an anti-Zionist. Syria was the last holdout in the Middle East that had been consistently anti-Zionist for the entirety of its history, which was more than 75 years, right? Syria was the best friend to the Palestinians in the Middle East. Yes, there might have been the odd little blip in relations between Syria and this group or that group of Palestinians, or the odd problem. But look at over the whole period, Syria never came to terms with the Zionist state. Syria never came to terms with imperialism in the Middle East. Syria battled to retain economic sovereignty. I remember being there in 2011 and I couldn't, and also media sovereignty. You couldn't easily get on Facebook and YouTube. You couldn't spend your Visa card. You know, all these are signs that a country is trying to protect itself, right? We go, oh, that's a bit not very modern, is it? But the reality is, oh, it's a bit inconvenient. No, this is a very positive sign. It's a sign that there was a government that was really trying to hold out against imperialism in the Middle East. And so I was making this point anyway. Sorry, going off on one about Syria. It was not the point, was it? But I was making this point on Twitter, like a fool. I should know better than to waste my time there. And somebody came back and said, "You're talking about anti-imperialism." And I said, "Yes, I am. You can't be anti-Zionist and not be anti-imperialist." And this is the really important lesson that needs to be brought home to people, because Zionism is a creation of British imperialism. It's a tool of Anglo-American imperialism. Its purpose is to create a proxy army that can be used to keep the Arab national liberation movement down. And it's very successfully done that for more than 100 years, right? But it took a huge effort for the imperialists to successfully fulfill their mission, which was to Zionize Judaism and Judaize Zionism, right? They had this huge project, and it was only after the Holocaust of Jews carried out by Nazi Germany that they were able opportunistically to jump on that, you know, the wave of sympathy for the European Jewish people that followed, you know, revelations of what had been going on, enabled them to push through the foundation of Israel and push through the narrative that said Jews aren't safe anywhere else, and Zionism was right all along, because masses of Jews, the absolute mass of Jews up until that point, had not been Zionists. They never bought into it. They had, on the contrary, because of how much they'd suffered in various ways under capitalism and under even in feudal conditions in Europe, but you know, for a long time in Europe, the sufferings that they had made them more likely to be revolutionaries. Up until World War II and even afterwards, Jews were disproportionately represented in the revolutionary movement. It's a terrible tragedy to see how many Jews, under the pressure and persuasion and bribery of US imperialist and British imperialist finance capital, turn themselves into stooges of Zionism and whitewash this horrific ideology and normalized it in the life of Europe in such a way that people didn't realize what was being done to them. They were being hoodwinked. They were being had. It was being the Zionist colony, which was brutal settler colony, apartheid, was always an apartheid state. It was always a genocidal state. These things that we see, these horrific crimes and these horrific ways of thinking and talking that we now see coming out of Gaza Live, there's documented evidence of exactly the same things happening in 1948 during the Nakba. But we weren't getting it as a live stream. You had to go and look for that information, and it was hard to find, and it was spread out around the world in books and then later on the internet. And for most people, they never came across it. It was never presented to us in mainstream media in the West, was it? What we were presented was, oh, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. Oh, it's the only place that's got gay liberation. It's the only place that's got women's liberation. Look at the lovely, what do they call their bloody farms? My brain's gone. Those things that were held up to us as communes, but turned out to be military camps.
Yes. I know what you're talking about. Kibbutzes.
The kibbutz. Thank you, for God's sake. I don't know.
Joe Biden was on him and his father was on a kibbutz on October 7th. He actually said that in one of the speech. But my dad lived in a kibbutz, and we were there on October 7th.
I'm sure it must be true then if Joe Biden said it.
Yeah.
So, but the point is, Zionism is an imperialist construct. It was an imperialist project. It serves imperialist aims, which is the suppression of the national liberation movement of the Arabs in order to control Arabia's resources and North Africa's resources, which is, of course, the oil and gas now. That was the whole function of Zionism. It's a tool, but it's a tool that resembles other tools they've created. If you look around the world, you see what was Nazism? What is Banderism? You know, everywhere around the world, what is ISIS? Everywhere around the world you look, you see, what about communalism in India? You know, where you have Sikh supremacism, you have Hindu supremacism, and then you have, you know, ISIS-type supremacism. Everywhere you look, you see religions and cultures and traditions being weaponized. You see the imperialists studying how a religion in a particular place works and looking for something they can pull out of it that they can make use of. And they'll take 2 or 3 things from the Quran or the way the Quran is interpreted in a certain place, and they'll go, I can use that. And they'll blow it up, and they'll farm it back to people. They'll set up special mosques that are run by people who've been trained by them. You know, when we look back at what was going on with Syria, there's something that I hadn't really understood what was going on until quite a few years later, which was during the period before the launch of the Syria war and the Iraq war, and before the rise of this apparently out of nowhere force called ISIS in Iraq and then Syria, which kind of blindsided a lot of us when it first appeared, and it was taking all this territory on the map, and we're like, what's this then? What is it? Where did it come from? You know, it seemed to come out of nowhere. What realized was there'd been this whole program of setting up, using Saudi money under the patronage of the royal family. Prince Charles was heavily involved, setting up a whole string of mosques across Britain. And their job was to find disenchanted young people who'd been let down, who didn't feel like they had a good future, most of whom had a Muslim heritage, but were basically secular and uneducated, and bring them into those mosques, make them into born-again Muslims, but of a type of Islam that's basically been created for them. And the whole job was to turn them into foot soldiers. They are the kids who ended up going from Birmingham to Syria, right? We saw there was a wave of them, wasn't there? The ISIS and all the other, you know, Islamic terrorist, supposedly jihadi armies that they were filled with cannon fodder that had been drawn from all over the world. It's the same thing they did with the Uyghur Muslims to try to use them against China. They took some aspect of their culture, some aspect of their religion, they weaponized it, they set up special mosques that said, this is your religion, this is the life you should be having, but those Chinese are stealing it from you. They weaponized the fact that people were uneducated and didn't have great prospects, disaffected, and they turned them into foot soldiers. And they do this all over the world. So it's exactly the same thing they've done with Zionism. They turned Jewish people into their foot soldiers by training them up in a version of their religion that has nothing to do with, or very little to do with, what Judaism is officially and used to always be known for, you know, peace and brotherhood, right? Nothing to do with that. They give them a warped version of their religion, and along with it, a hefty dose of racist supremacy. They put these Europeans in the middle of the Middle East. They said, this is your homeland, which it isn't. These people are in your way, and anyway, they're not really people. They don't count. And here's a quote from the Old Testament that proves that they don't count. God says they're the Amalek, and you've got to wipe them all out. And they've been telling them that for 80 years, Garland. We heard Netanyahu say Amalek, and we were shocked. My God, how can people talk that way in this day and age? But in Israel, that's been standard discourse the entire time. Most of us didn't know about it. That's all. And those of us who did weren't listened to, because it just you sound crazy, right? You sound like, you know, when this is not confirmed by any mainstream source and people don't have direct experience themselves, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. You can easily be marginalized as some kind of nutter when you make these points, even though it's actually documented by Israeli historians, a lot of this stuff. But again, you know, these books are quietly shelved. They don't get they're not constantly brought to the attention of ordinary British people, and it's never been understood. There's a certain presentation in the West, in Western Europe and the USA, of what the Israeli project is, which is completely at odds with the reality. But you know, we've been taught to buy into. And what I think has been really important about the process of media coverage of the genocide this time around, which is only a continuation of the genocide that's been going on in slow motion. I remember I used to say that to people. There's a slow motion genocide happening in Palestine. And they would say to me, oh, you can't say that. You can't say that. But now it's clear to see this is a continuation of a genocide that was already ongoing in a slow motion way for a long time. There was a big genocidal outburst in 1948, and then there was slow motion genocide carrying on for 75 years after that. Now we've had another massive intensification, but it's in the glare of publicity. And the publicity has come not because of mainstream media suddenly getting a conscience, but because mainstream media can't pretend it's not happening, because if they do, they're totally exposed by the live streaming of it to people's phones via social media. So this has been the positive aspect of social media. There are some parts of it that just can't be totally controlled, and people are seeing now, and they're getting a lesson. They're getting a live streamed lesson in this is what imperialism demands for its survival. Is this all right with you?
Joti Brar, tell everyone where they can find you and follow you online and all of your stuff, your organization.
So Joti Brar, that's my name. I have a Telegram channel. My party, it's the CPGB-ML, but the Communists is our Telegram channel. It's also our website, thecommunists.org. Do please go there and sign up. If you can, subscribe to our physical newspaper, because there's nothing like physical literature to really help you understand the life and what's going on in the world. Really, the information sticks much better in your mind if you read it off the paper than if you read it on a screen. But anyway, you can sign up to our newsletters there. We also have a very good YouTube channel called Proletarian TV, where we always replicate these shows with me and Garland, but we also have speeches, presentations going back, 15 odd years on topics of everything of importance. So check that out.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And make sure you follow me on Telegram and Rockfin and Rumble and all of that stuff. And as always, the most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you very much. We're out.